sometimes how we phrase questions, like how we phrase word problems, really lends itself to the kinds of evidence that we want to gather. So unfortunately, I don't have a video that shows this, but I usually ask my students to do a couple of things, to explain their work, and sometimes when they're explaining their work with a partner and they both have different answers, then they have to justify. So it's knowing the difference. So sometimes before I send students off to work independently, I go over what the goal of the lesson is. And so a part of the goal, going over the goal, is going over the success criteria. How can you yourself determine whether or not you've met the goal? And always a part of the success criteria, it comes down to explaining and having to just explaining their work. Sometimes, depending on the type of problem, it'll be to justify. So in this conference, and sometimes I conference with one student, and sometimes what happens is that it becomes a conference with two students, especially if I want to sort of scaffold them to do something different. And sometimes it becomes a table conference. Or those of you who conference with your students know that when you sit in conference with one student, everyone else in that table is listening. And what you just gave as feedback to one, everyone in that table is now taking that and applying it, and it's like, look at my work, I actually did it. And it's like, after I explained it. But so you only conference with three, but how many have benefit from those three conferences that you actually gave? So a couple of things. Their explanation, it was pretty detailed. They were able to explain how they were decomposed that 224 into 4 equivalent groups. If you noticed, even when reiterating or paraphrasing what they were saying, I interjected and kind of threw out a word here and there that I really wanted them to be able to, like the word partition. Maybe they didn't use it, but let me just remind them that that's a word that we can use, So, it's not that it was wrong or that they were wrong, but, here's a word that maybe you want to try instead of breaking into, or you can see where she tried saying it at the beginning, wasn't too sure, and just went into saying equal groups. Which again wasn't wrong. Towards the end of that conference, there were a couple of things that I wanted to leave them with. One, I just wanted to see more or less the language that was being used when they had to justify. The explanation, I'm detailed, but can they justify why that answer is wrong? And, why that their answer was right. Their justification, as you can see, I know it's right because, I did it rather quickly, and I felt very comfortable with it, right? And it's like, okay, well, let's see if we can help this child or help them both to become a little bit more elaborate when having to justify their reasoning. But being able to do that means there's something about the content that they also need to know, and that's how to check for understanding. So it's being able to sort of balance both, and when, now let's check for understanding, what strategy might we use to build back up. And in doing that, then I would like to come back and assess and see, did their justification change? Did the language around the justification, being able to do that, the explanation, the justification, did that change? When is it content and when is it language related? And so that's where even posing a question like I did at a particular moment at the end really lends itself to see, is it the math or is it the language that's, that still needs to be refined a bit. And so then here is a next step that you can work on. And so we go over how to build back to that number. So I already threw that in there that she didn't have to think, oh, I have to take all these 56 to build back to that 24. That's what I'm doing mathematically. So now that she has that and I know she understood that, now I'm just eliciting how that justification is being shared. Sometimes what happens when we conference with students or try to understand their work is that sometimes we put in a lot of what we think versus what they really understand or, really what their take was. So in having them explain to me first and then, coming back and saying, oh, I noticed that this is what you did, it validates their work, but it also gives you an understanding as to where that child might be, So sometimes it's best, not sometimes, but it's always best to have them explain to you first. And then you can try to make sense of where to take this next, and then to try to make sense and say, oh, did you do this first or did you do that? Because with some students, they'll make them shut down and say, yeah, that's what I did. So then it becomes really hard to be able to get them to then explain. Why? Because they know that you'll explain it for them. And sometimes I do have students who I want them to share a strategy in front of the entire class. And it's like, oh, can you share your work? And they'll turn and you look at me and say, well, can you share it for me? And it's like, no, let's see if we can share it together. And even in sharing it together, usually, it's all, the child who's explaining. I'll introduce the child. Well, not introduce, but, say a little bit, something about the strategy, but then the entire explanation becomes a student's work.